Thanks everyone for being here today. Obviously in our nation right now we're facing a number of issues. Law enforcement really needed support at a time like this. We're here today to give them that support. But we also have to get our economy back on track. And that's another reason I think this bill that we're talking about today is so important. Because if people don't feel safe to go out and eat, if they don't feel safe to go shopping, then we're going to have a hard time growing this economy back to what it was. And I think that's another important aspect that we need to talk about today. So this bill that Senator Brewer and I are honored to be bringing forward has two parts. I'll talk about the first part as it relates to government, and then we'll allow him to get into as it relates to individuals. Really, as it relates to government, the first part does three things. It ensures that if you are convicted of any of the crimes that Senator Brewer outlined, you are no longer qualified for government benefits or government employment. Second, it ensures that citizens will have the opportunity to make their voices heard if any proposals are put forward to defund the police. It requires a separate budget hearing for that item. It requires a separate vote on that item to ensure that politicians can't claim they were simply voting for a budget when they were really voting to defund the police. We will put a stop to that. Third, it ensures that we have the law enforcement services we need. It prevents the abolition of the law enforcement agency by a political subdivision unless it's really called for through a merger or some sort of population service issue where citizens will be getting the law enforcement services they need. So I think this is really important to ensure that we give law enforcement the support they need and deserve for doing the job to protect our communities, because without that we won't be able to get our economy back on track. So I'm honored to have everyone here with us today, and with that I'll turn it over to Senator Brewer to outline the second piece of the legislation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Andrew. I'll try and throttle up the volume a little bit here so you can hear me. The events that happened here at the end of May on this very street, in this very spot here, is part of the reason why this was necessary. The other part about this bill and why we've had to bring it is because the law enforcement communities approached us and they feel abandoned. And I feel like I'm in the middle of this because my brother is a county sheriff. My children were part of the National Guard presence that was a part of the response to this. And I think if we're going to be honest about how folks feel about their personal security, many of the things we're going to talk about here are going to address that. So before I get started, special thanks to all the senators who took the time out of their busy schedules, many campaigning to come here today so that they can support law enforcement. And at the end, I'll introduce General Bacon, and we'll get a little more of a federal perspective on this. So with that said, the two parts we're going to talk about, this being the second part, the penalty part. The first one is the prohibiting of violent assemblies. It will be a Class 3A felony when 6 or more people assemble and cause serious damage to property or bodily injury to others. It will be prohibited to unlawfully obstruct a roadway, or it will be unlawful to obstruct or by act of violence any roadways. A Class 3A felony to obstruct a traffic. It will be a Class 3 felony for obstructing emergency responders during their preservation of life while en route with the victim. And just as a quick reference, 3 and 3A is essentially 3 years or 4 years of imprisonment, along with supervisory after they're released. All right, next will be the mandatory minimum sentence for mob violence against police. Striking a police officer during a violent or disorderly assembly will carry a mandatory minimum sentence with it. Now, striking can also be not just the act of punching someone, but also throwing an object, a bottle, whatever. Next will be the offense for the sentencing, and that is conspiracy to organize, including funding a violent assembly resulting in property damage or bodily harm. And then next will be the assault of a law enforcement officer or emergency responders or healthcare workers during a violent or disorderly assembly. Now, we've already started to get calls, and here's the part that's a little discouraging is people won't listen to what the actual bill is going to do. They assume the worst. You're taking away the First Amendment. Let me reassure you, that is not why we're here to take away the First Amendment. The reason this is necessary is because of the events that are happening around the country, but that happened right here in Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, with that said, I want to emphasize, too, the part that Senator LeGrone mentioned about supporting our law enforcement. We're at a point now where law enforcement are struggling to be able to do their job, and this act is going to help them to have teeth so that they're not in a position where they have to watch events happen, but they can actually respond to them. So, with that said, I'm going to introduce General Bacon. Congressman Bacon. Him and I served together at Offutt Air Force Base. He will always be General Bacon to me, but I'm honored to be able to introduce him at this time. Colonel.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate that. Hey, it's great to be here in sunny Lincoln. Boy, it feels great out here. And I want to thank the chairman and the vice chairman. I thank the senators here I've had the pleasure to work with on a variety of issues. Great patriots and leaders in our state, and I thank each and every one of them. We defend the right to peaceful protest. It's the First Amendment right. I defend it with my life, and we all do. I know Tom Brewer did when he was a colonel in the Army, and I feel that same way. But those who loot, that is not a First Amendment right. When you destroy a small business, when you injure an innocent person on the street, which has been happening, when you beat up a cop. I was talking to a female cop in Omaha that had bruises up and down her arm because she was being hit during those riots in May. Those people deserve to go to jail. They deserve to do the time. And it's just too often that they're not being held accountable right now. So we defend with our life peaceful protest, but looting, destroying, injuring people is not a right. And folks who do that deserve to be held accountable and go to jail. And so our cops deserve this extra protection. They've been getting injured at a very high incidence from all over our country right now. Folks who have destroyed small businesses, many of them have insurance, but they don't have insurance that covers looting. Those folks deserve to go to jail. And politicians who've been bailing them out are reprehensible, and it's been happening too often. So I support this effort because our law enforcement deserve it, our small businesses deserve it. We had a lady or a gentleman was mugged recently during one of the protests in Omaha, and that person didn't do any jail time. People need to be held accountable for doing this. We want peaceful protest, and we want peace. We want to have safety in our communities. So I support a federal legislation as well called Back to Blue Act, which makes if you injure or hurt a federal law enforcement official, it becomes a federal crime. But also puts money and grant money towards community policing as well, which works so well here in Omaha particularly. I can't speak for Lincoln. And I appreciate the leadership that we saw, like in Omaha when we had the violence occur. I know that the mayor, the governor really tried to intervene fast and de-escalate and put wraps around it, but we're not seeing that in many parts of our country, and we need to make clear what Nebraska can stand for. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity, I appreciate the chairman, I appreciate the vice chairman, and I'll yield back to you. Thank you.
All right, at this time we're going to go ahead and open it for questions.
Joanne?
Oh, I'm sorry, Joanne. You're in the sun.
How are you defining disorderly assembly?
Gonna lean on my lawyer friend here.
Well, the specific language is obviously being worked out before a bill is introduced next year. But really what it gets down to is violent acts and that type, like the type of things that we see where just down here you had a building burn, you can still see broken windows in many of them. Those violent acts are what we're talking about, what we're trying to prevent. We absolutely support the right to peacefully protest, as the Congressman stated. And this is getting at the people who really threaten that right by committing violent acts.
Next question.
Those acts that you speak of, they're already illegal. Why do you need a law?
Because
If somebody violates somebody's rights, they break into a business, they do vandalism, that's already illegal.
So what this is doing is ensuring that these specific acts, that you have serious penalties for that, because we need to ensure that law enforcement is supported and that these violent acts stop, and that's why we're making them, ensuring that there are more serious penalties, which is what Senator Brewer talked about with the sentence enhancements, to be clear that there's going to be some consequences.
I just maybe add into that, people aren't being held accountable right now, so this is, people represent a great constituency saying it's unacceptable, so it's really just highlighting the need for this, saying it's not being done. I'll give you another example of why, of something that I've been involved with too. We had an officer killed 2 years ago, maybe a little longer now, and there was a straw purchase involved of someone went to a store, legally bought a gun, illegally gave it to a felon who then murdered the police officer. That person didn't spend a day in jail. We find that happens all the time. These people aren't being held accountable. So sometimes, even though there's a law against it, as lawmakers, you want to say this is not right. We expect our county attorneys and prosecutors to hold people's feet to the fire. And so this is really, it's making a statement from our constituencies that this is wrong. But thank you for the question.
And someone's going from a misdemeanor to a felony.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Gotta go home now.
Okay.
Your law would make it a felony to obstruct traffic during an unpermitted protest. Martin Luther King frequently did this. Wouldn't this law turn Martin Luther King into a felon?
The difference is between a peaceful protest and a violent protest.
Doesn't say that. It says unpermitted protest.
You haven't seen the law we've written yet.
You just said you haven't written the law. That's what that guy just said. You haven't written the law.
Well, exactly. We haven't written it yet. Why are you quoting it?
Then why are you giving a press conference on the law you have not written? This is just a political stunt. You don't know what it is,
And
but
you're
you...
entitled to your opinion. What's your question?
My question is for the congressman. You just said that the officer in Omaha was injured and the person was not held accountable. Does that mean the mayor of Omaha is not doing her job?
This happened 2 years ago, and the person was actually down south in a different state, and so that person should have been held accountable, should have done jail time, and I'm just going to leave it at that. It was wrong for someone who aided a murder by knowingly giving a weapon to a killer, where a cop was killed. And so, yes, I'm not blaming the mayor because actually the person was in not even in our city up there, but was released by another, I can't remember which city, it was down south. So, but anyway, we need to hold people accountable. That's the thing. And in this situation, we're seeing a lot of violence being committed, and people are being held accountable, and it's wrong. And when people who injure a cop, they should know that it's wrong. And we support peaceful protest with violence. It needs to be held accountable, and our constituents want better.
All right. Questions?
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and we appreciate you being here.
I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I didn't know no one else was going to ask her. In Lincoln, we had some protesters who were protesting peacefully who were injured by police. Does this cover any of that?
So the new criminal penalties only address individuals who are committing violence during these unlawful protests. So that's what this bill is going to be about.
So police aren't being held accountable for injuring peaceful protesters?
I think if you look at law enforcement in Nebraska, they're going above and beyond to ensure that they hold bad cops accountable. And I think that we need to support law
That's not happening. That's not happening.
I really think that they're definitely working hard to ensure that they police themselves as well.
Senator, I have a question.
Yeah.
In some of these violent incidences, it was reported that outside entities were actually paying other folks to come in and instigate this violence. As you consider writing this bill, are you considering measures that might hold those folks who pay for insurgents like that and that sort of violence accountable for their...
Absolutely. That gets to the conspiracy point that Senator Brewer was mentioning and talking about. So I'll let him finish that. But yes, this also addresses folks who aspire to carry out the violence.
That'll fall back on your question there. Conspiracy to organize, which includes funding, violent assembly resulting in the property damage or bodily harm. So that's kind of the general paragraph that's going to be worked into.
Thank you, sir.
Do you know who's going to sponsor the bill?
We'll probably, as we get closer, see who's got a priority bill and can make sure that it has the ability to get through, because without a priority, all the bills are kind of in jeopardy.
So no, you don't know yet.
Well, I would think it will probably be one of us here, but if no one else does, I will.
How do you hold somebody accountable who organized what they thought would be a peaceful protest and somebody gets out of hand?
Well, I don't think that's included. I think if you're organized a peaceful protest, nobody's got a problem with that. It's when you purposely do things that are going to result in it being a violent protest. If you provide weapons, or you provide
Molotov cocktails,
accelerants, things like that are going to turn it into a violent protest. Okay, one more time. Any more?
I have one question. So in the law, since you said that you did not write out the law yet, are you going to explicitly define the difference between a peaceful protest and a violent protest? Because right now, what you guys put out basically said any protest, you're going to be getting a felony for it.
No. What we said is there's a difference between a violent protest and a peaceful protest. That's pretty easy to understand.
What's your definition of that, though?
If you become violent, it's a violent protest.
That's already illegal.
Yes, but
You
why
can't
don't we
commit-
increase the penalty so that you go to jail for a long time if you decide to do it?
Now, what's the process? Sorry, I have a question. So what's the process for proving that the person that is violent, hello? So what's the process for proving that the person that is violent during the protest is actually the person who is prosecuted? Because there are a lot of instances where instigators come to a peaceful protest, like a protest here where it's been proven to be peaceful. There are outside influencers that come in and create violence that isn't us. But then in retaliation, our police officers come out and squat here and shoot our protesters, yet they don't get charged with any felonies for assaulting the people they're supposed to be protecting, instead of coming into the protest, pulling out those particular protesters that are being violent, and then protecting the rest of the protesters. Because I've spoken to police officers a lot, spoken to a lot of police captains, and they agree that police brutality is wrong, no matter which side of the blue line you stand on. So, in future incidences, when you're putting felonies on top of protesting, which is inhibiting our First
We're not
Amendment
putting
rights.
felonies on protesting. We're putting felonies on protesting with violence.
Yeah, right.
But I
the
agree with you. I
protesting-
agree. They
but
gotta
you're
separate.
assuming that the protesting that is